So tell me about the new film, Midnight Movies, from the margin to the mainstream. What about this genre of film spoke to you and inspired you to make this documentary?
Well, it's got a very curious history. I mean, I've had a couple of careers. I mean, documentary filmmaking is my third career, actually. I started out as a professor. I was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania for 15 years in the 70s. And I started one of the first courses ever in the history department to deal with film and culture and popular culture. And when I was teaching at that time, this was in the mid-70s, my students really turned me on to the whole midnight movie phenomena. And I went to see it. And then when I left teaching, sort of at the end of the 70s, when I knew that there was things going to be different at the university, I wrote a book on it called Midnight Movies. It happened to come out the same month as Hoberman's book.
Oh, no.
So we killed each other off in some way.
Oh, no.
And it was at the end of the phenomena. It came out in about 81. So that was a book I wrote more or less at that time. I said I wanted people to remember this phenomenon because I thought it was important. And I treated it as an academic subject because that's what it was at that time, as an academic. And then almost 25 years later, 3 years ago, I looked at it again and I said, wow, this would be a great documentary movie.
Oh, yeah.
And I saw it and I called around to the directors and they all agreed to get on camera. And I said, okay, why not? I'll see. So I basically wrote the book in 1980 and made a movie on it in the 1990s. I mean, in 2005. So it was a long time. It was 25 years.
Well, we actually had, we did a David Lynch tribute show, and we had Ben Barenholtz on our show, and he discussed a little bit with us the origins of the Midnight Movie and his role in it, and he was, of course, essential, and he's featured in your documentary.
Yes.
But if you could reiterate for us how the Midnight Movie began with El Topo, and why that film was the ideal film to start off that motion.
I think it's very hard for people to understand the context of movies at that time. We're so used to triplexes and multiplexes and all. At that time, movie theaters were single theaters that were run by very passionate people who programmed them in a particular way, like Ben Barenholtz in New York. And many of these theaters were anchored to university towns around the United States. So in the late 60s and early, particularly 69, 70, 71, there was a real change from the Summer of Love to being beaten on the head by National Guardsmen, and as a result, there was a real pullback in terms of people gathering. There were very few places to gather, very few places to meet people who had the same inclination. So what happened is that movie theaters, particularly in the weekends, became sort of sanctuaries, very privileged spaces to show things that were not allowed to be in the established culture.
Yeah.
And as a result, a movie like El Topo, which was so outside the system, so outside cinematic experience, when that started to be shown in New York at the Elgin Theater, it generated not just a movie-going public, but it became an event. It became an experience. And there was the kind of repetition that really made midnight movies unique. And the ones I concentrated on, the 6 classic ones, all had that ability. Not just that people went to see them, but they were literally films that people almost had a dedication to the way they have today in some cases around something like Star Wars, which became later. These were the first cult films in the real sense. And these movie houses around the United States would show them, and not only show them for just a short period of time, they would show them for years. And ritualistically, people would come week in and week out to these particular experiences, which were outside the traditional experience of the cinema.
Yeah, and I know that you mentioned that they were located near college campuses. I know the college kids were crucial in ensuring the Midnight Movie's success, but it also attracted high-profile people within the culture, too. I know that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were huge fans of El Topo. And
in some ways, they were the cause of the demise of El Topo. But at the same time, there's the reason why they were, and the way the Warhol crowd, or the legacy of that crowd, or people like, all the intellectuals who had been in the forefront of the college campus revolutions in the 60s, where did they find some kind of new vision? They found it in some of these young filmmakers and some of these young kind of new people, not out of Hollywood, but out of the world. Look, Jodorowsky was from Mexico. It's a Mexican film. Rocky Horror really came from London. movies that, The Harder They Come was from Jamaica. So these are films, and Night of the Living Dead was really from Pittsburgh, So all of these were way outside the system. And as being outside the system, they had a unique perspective. And that's what I think people get, why universities love it. It was a unique perspective. It was a perspective that they weren't getting anywhere else.
Well, in the case of Night of the Living Dead, obviously it's a thinly veiled, first and foremost, it's a very effective scare picture that pushes boundaries, but it's also a thinly veiled commentary on racism and possibly the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Do you think that's what made that film catch on as it did and survive to this day?
Well, it made two things it did. One thing is as Romero says in the film, he says before this time, horror films were jokes. They were making fun of people. They were, 50-foot monsters. What this film did, it scared people, okay? Just like Manson scared people. Just like Vietnam scared people. Just like death started to scare people. It wasn't just making fun of horror anymore. Horror became so real. And what sort of Romero tapped into was and he made it. He came from news. He came from he tried to replicate what was going on in Watts and Vietnam, the way his camera would work, and that everything was designed to make you feel uncomfortable and feel scared and upset. And in some ways, that was the intention, because that was what was happening around people all the time. You were feeling, scared and upset, and that movie tapped into that.
Yeah. I want to cover some of these other movies that you profile in your film. The Rocky Horror Picture Show. I mean, talk about a phenomenon that is so unique in that it still exists widely in midnight houses today. What do you attribute that success to?
Well, basically because it's about sex and about sexuality. It's the one thing that it has that is different from all the other midnight movies. It is the one that has an experience that all people have to go through in all times and all periods. Different than being scared. We're jaded by being scared. So Night of the Living Dead is kind of like almost funny today. But Rocky Horror is about going from innocence to sexuality.
Yeah.
Everybody goes through that. And so it becomes a ritual experience for many people. Yeah. And that's what has kept its kind of ability to sort of each generation reinvent itself. Now the film is almost second nature. It's going through the experience where people, 10, 12, 13-year-old kids now can actually show and physically work out that relationship from going from innocence to sexuality in front of other people.
I'm 34 years old. I'm still going through it.
Well, we're all that way. So sexuality is not something that you leave behind. It's something that's always there. And I think that's its power. It's about sexuality in its purest form. It's about all sexuality. And it's about it's a kind of homage to sexuality. And in that way, it becomes very, every generation can take something from it.
Yeah, and what's amazing to me, and it certainly dawned on me as I was watching your film, is how very different all of these films are. And it seems to me that The Harder They Come, in a way, seems like the oddball out of the group.
Right.
Because what sparked that following?
Well, that's kind of got a unique history, because in some ways, it's the most influential of all those films, and in a popular culture sense, not in a filmic sense. It didn't have really a filmic influence, and Perry Hensel just died recently, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Sort of really never really made another film of that nature. But what it did is that for an audience at that time, don't forget reggae. Night of the Living Dead. The Harder They Come introduced reggae to America. It's one of the first times a film introduced a musical phenomenon. Reggae was popular in England. It had not been popular in America. What happened is that when they brought reggae, when Bob Marley first came to America, he came to Boston, because that's where The Harder They Come had been playing at the Boston, at Larry Jackson's Theater. And it prepped the audience so much so that it helped sort of really spark and then take off the whole reggae craze. So it dealt with a whole musical style that was very different. It's almost like the rap of that period. And secondly, it was about black-white relations. It wasn't about black-white relations in America, but it was about a black man that white people could feel and connect to. And that was important to that film as well.
Yeah. Pink Flamingos is chronicled in your film.
Right.
John Waters, obviously, he's one of a kind. What were your impressions upon meeting and spending time with John Waters during the shooting of this? And what do you think makes him an important filmmaker?
Well, because he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly. He says he wants to upset people. He figures it out how to upset. Pink Flamingos was a very intentional film on his part to do something that had never been done before, and he did it in a way that was, in some sense, very pure. And in many cases, he's done the same film over and over again over most of his life, but he still is at the basic notion that film's purpose is to upset people's notions of reality or notions of normalcy. You know, unfortunately, with John Waters, is that the society has caught up with him. Because you know, you can't make any films that are more outrageous anymore because they become almost, you know, too much popular hero films. And, you know, they become hits in Hollywood because there's nothing that can offend people anymore. So it's hard for John Waters to make these kinds of films that have that basic intentionality about it, about offending people, to upset their values and beliefs. It's unfortunate that we in some ways, the irony has caught up to his filmmaking.
And he does address that in your film as well.
Yes.
And it's interesting how you speak of his urge to challenge the perception of normalcy. Mm-hmm. Because another film that you profile is David Lynch's Eraserhead.
Right.
And he's obviously crafted an exceptional career on the heels of Eraserhead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what strikes me most about this segment of your film is it really speaks to a time when theater owners nourished these films. And Ben Barenholtz, I think he spent 2 years nourishing this film before it really took off.
Yeah. I mean, that's extraordinary. Think about anybody doing that today. Well, we have the Internet that maybe helps that out with things like Blair Witch or 28 Days, but this was an extraordinary, and this is why I think a lot of people owe a lot of debt to Ben, you know, or people and theater owners like that. Unfortunately, these people are not well known, but these people are really the ones who really kept this stuff going.
Yeah, and now you're just prisoner to the opening weekend, and then you're gone.
Yeah, but. You know what? One of the things I had hoped in doing this, you know, both when I wrote the book and the movie, is to get people to understand that movie-going is a different kind. It's a communal experience.
Yeah.
We've gotten to a point where our relationship to imagery has become microscopic, where we're so much larger than the imagery that we relate to. And movie-going, particularly with people who have some kind of connecting to you, some kind of values that you're connected to, it's not just that they're going to this weekend movie because this is the best one of that week. There's some reason they go to it. And that experience of people in that darkened movie theater responding to what images up on the screen and coming out of it changed or altered or somewhat connected in a different way is really what's missing. And that's what I hope to sort of go back to, because midnight movies would not have been and Lynch and Romero and all these people would not be anywhere now if the audiences hadn't discovered them. That was the key element of these midnight movies. They were discovered not by critics. They weren't discovered by distributors or studios. They were found by audiences and by programmers of these movie theaters.
You're absolutely right. And part of the magic of movies is that shared experience. And
yes.
And today you have home entertainment that's taken such a great leaps that people don't want to leave their house to watch a film anymore. They watch it in solitary confinement, and a lot of that magic is missing as a result, I think.
Yeah. I think I have Ebert in my film says, can you imagine watching Rocky Horror by yourself
at
home?
Yeah.
You know?
The rise and fall of the genre is right there in your title.
Right.
You know, they thrive on the margins, but when they become mainstream, they die, essentially.
Well, you know, they die, but it's also a comment on our culture. I think it's a comment of the crisis of the culture today. When everything that is potentially on the margin, and what I mean by the margin, something that can critique the society from outside the society, can give you a perspective outside the one that we're in, you know, with the media perspective.
Right.
Something can have that perspective. What happens, unfortunately, in those days, they were discovered and people adored them and went to them and they ritualized them. But today, anything that is marginal becomes automatically mainstream the next day because of the way the media takes marginality and loses its power from its perspective and brings it inside the mass phenomenon of media. And as a result, nothing can exist that really outside the margin, the mainstream anymore, because everything's become mainstream. So that the worst things, the worst atrocities, in some ways, become part of the mainstream culture. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that dumbs us down and also, numbs us in a way from being able to really critique what's going on around us without sort of falling into platitudes or simple cliches.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the enduring legacy of these films, and you spoke a little bit during the John Waters question, but
right.
How the influence we see in the films of today from this genre of movie.
Well, you know what I think? The influence is that each one of the films is a critique of genre. It's a critique of the system.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. But more than that, I think it's Lynch says this, and Ben Barenholtz says it in the movie. He says these people gave other people an experience and an example that it was possible. It was possible to make a film that had your vision in it. It was possible to make a film outside the system. It was possible to take an idea and craft it with your friends and put it together and come out with some kind of product at the end and put it up on a screen. Yeah. That's what made these movies unique. They were personal visions. And I think that the power of these movies was that it told other filmmakers at the time, wow, if you have an idea, if you have a belief, you have a thought, it's possible to do it, to bring it out. It isn't that they have to sell your soul to the studio. You have to sort of bend down and let other people tell you what to do. But if you wanted it so much that you were able to get enough people and spend enough time and energy to get this thing finished, so all you had to do was get it done, whether it be 16 millimeter or whatever it is, to get it up on the screen there, and people would come, and that's your experience, and that was possible. And I think that was the legacy of the midnight movies. And I think it taught a lot of people that things like that were, that sitting at home, watching those movies or going to those movies, going back home and say, well, maybe I can make a movie like that.
Yeah, and your chronicle of the midnight movies in this documentary is just incredibly inspiring. And but I can't let you go without asking you about your next film. Tell me if I'm correct, if I read this correctly.
Right.
Your next film, 27.
Right.
I think that this is fascinating. What can you tell us about this one?
Well, it's actually the germ of the film is in midnight movies. There's a point which I said that all fell apart. It fell apart between 1970 and 71, and what I've always looked for, and what I'm doing in midnight movies, and particularly in 27, I'm looking at what happened to the 60s. What happened to the belief that you could change the world to one that you felt kind of fear and trembling in terms and retreated into your own neuroses or your own escapism. And what I'm doing is try to find out that and try to hook it to three things. I'm hooking it to the deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
Because they all died at the age of 27, and they all died between September 1970 and July 71. And in that period happened everything that we know as the 60s, from Kent State to Manson murders to Altamont to Cambodia to Nixon's inauguration, all of that, to Berkeley riots. So what I'm doing is telling the story of that year and a half through the lives of these three people as a way to understand the end of the 60s.
Mm. I cannot wait to see that one.
Yeah, I'm almost finished.
Well, will you come back and join us whenever you're ready to bring that out and tell us more about it?
You should be hearing about it in January.
Okay.
Great.
Well, please come back to us come that time, because we'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, no, it's a very special film. It's because it's all about the same. It's the same story. It's the same question. I think a lot of people, young people as well as older people. Brian De Palma still has the fire in the belly.
Yeah.
I'm the same age as Brian De Palma. And in some ways, my passion is in trying to use the medium to make people look, both younger people who weren't there, understand the context of history and culture, because I'm an historian, that's where I started, but also the people who went through it understand the relationship between culture and politics, between intellectuals and their society, and in particular, in this case, between music or film and the way it's expressing what's happening in the world at the time.
In the world, absolutely.
Everybody, our next guest, Ben Barenholtz, has been an invaluable force in the motion picture business since the late 60s. The inventor of the midnight movie, Mr. Barenholtz was instrumental in the success of countless underground films. In 1977, through his own specialty film distribution company, Libra Films, He nourished Lynch's first feature, Eraserhead, until it entered the stratosphere of cult classic. In the years that followed, Mr. Barenholtz turned to producing, working as executive producer on the Coen Brothers films Miller's Crossing and Barton Fink, and as co-executive producer on Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream.
Wow.
For the first time in his illustrious career, Mr. Barenholtz has gone behind the camera lens and directed his first feature-length film, the documentary Music In, which chronicles the formation of the first school of jazz. It is our pleasure to welcome Mr. Ben Barenholtz to the show.
Ben, are you there?
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
That's quite a illustrious career you've had.
Oh, it's all propaganda.
No, it's not. It's wonderful.
Fantastic. How did it come to you that you could that there was a place for specialty films and midnight movies?
Well, I had I opened the Elgin Theater in 1968, and actually I was quite broke at the time, and I went to the Filmmakers Co-op and convinced them to put in Chelsea Girls on the second run for a month, and I didn't have any money to get started, really, so they gave me $48. Actually, we ran Chelsea Girls for a month, and then the co-op pulled out, and I started programming it myself. So,
right. So they say that you are the inventor of midnight movies?
Invent any? I think that has to be clarified a little bit. Is that I think there were movies that played at midnight in the 20s. I think what was innovative in any sense in what I did, it was the first time that a film was actually launched at midnight as opposed to without it playing anywhere else, and that was El Topo. And it was more of a financial thing. It came about with because of the struggles of running a theater without money, and I was trying to utilize as much of the time as I could. Was one element, and the other thing is that they also noticed that particularly in Broadway, off-Broadway shows would open, and in their previews they would do sell-out business, and then as soon as they got the review in the New York Times and it was bad, and it closed the next day. So we were always trying to find an alternative way of reaching a narrow audience economically.
Right.
So out of that, when Alan Douglas came along after he bought El Topo, and he had about $10,000 to open. I just told him, you know, that's not going to work. You're going to get killed on that film. Your reviews are not going to be good. So why don't you let me try opening it at midnight and without advertising? And, well, within a few weeks, we were selling out a 600-seat theater 7 nights a week. Actually, Friday and Saturday, it went on at 1 in the morning.
Oh, goodness.
And
wow.
It ran for 6 months, and then John Lennon and Yoko Ono were there a few times, and they wound up buying the film, and Alan Klein, who was their accountant, or whoever, manager, accountant, and they opened it on Broadway, I think. Huge signs, Alan Klein Presents, and big advertising campaign. I think it lasted about 3 days. I think they were so embarrassed that they pulled it out of circulation for a long time.
Well, you started your own distribution company, Libra Films, in '75, was it?
Yeah.
And a couple of years later, you came across Eraserhead. I would think the release on Eraserhead said '77.
Yeah. Well, actually, the person should really receive credit is because it did play, I think, at the in L.A. at the AFI, and it was a film named John Quinn that called me, and he said, "You've got to see this film." And when they sent me the print, and I was in the middle of the screening, And I just told Fred Baker, who was working for me at that time, just get him on the phone, I want this. And he thought I was out of my bird.
What potential did you see in it?
It's not a question. You know, I'm not an academic. I never had an agenda or anything. So even at my Elgin days, the reason I did get so many different things in there, because if it looked good or if it touched me, and I also had a lot of kids working for me that were helpful, and
right.
I would just play anything since I just love film. I wasn't interested in any. I didn't have an agenda of any kind or an aesthetic that I tried to follow. Right.
Did you have a plan? Did you have a plan to get these movies recognized? Because I understand.
Well, I think one of the elements of distribution, particularly on difficult films, is that you don't really go in with a plan. You let the film in itself will really tell you how to distribute it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a question of economics and how you get to a specific audience, particularly a difficult film. And certainly Eraserhead, one of my associates at that time, after he saw the film, told me that I was out of my mind and it wouldn't make a dime. Well, it paid my rent for 10 years.
Oh, goodness. How long did it run? I think it had like a 2-year run or something.
Well, no, Eraserhead actually. I didn't have the Elgin at that time. I'd left that, and I opened it at the Cinema Village. I think there was an audience of 25. And first night, second night was 24. I told David it was working, and he looked at me as if I was out of my. I understood. There was one element of understanding after seeing Eraserhead, and as I told David at the time, he was just about 10 years ahead of his time.
Right.
And that it was going to take a lot of work and patience to do it. So the release was very, very slow. There were even times in the first year where I would not let certain exhibitors play it. I'd get a call from Dallas or Kansas City or whatever, and I would say, no, it's too early. Wait till next year. Word of mouth has to catch up with it. So it wasn't that huge runaway success. It just was much slower in developing.
It was a slow build, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What was the general consensus among those who watched it? What did they think of it?
They didn't know what to make of it. I never told David that half the audience the first 2 days were friends of mine. So it wasn't even, they weren't even all a paying audience. I couldn't get it reviewed. I couldn't get any critics to see it. I think I happened to find, I think the only write-up I got on it was in the Village Eye. It doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or it existed for a blink of that eye. I think Gary, Indiana, interviewed David, and that was its only. But slowly, it sort of became the film to see, the thing to do.
Yeah, it was definitely buzzed about. I know that. And it was so influential. I think Francis Coppola, I had read, saw it and loved it, and obviously Mel Brooks saw it and was very taken by it. Did you have any interaction with these industry people that were seeing it?
No, not at all, as I try to limit my interaction with industry people to this day.
Wise man.
I don't know if it's wisdom or it's lunacy. Maybe a bit of both. But I actually think it had a greater influence in the UK because it played in a theater called Screen on the Hill for many years, even after, because I had a 10-year agreement on the film, and I actually drew up a contract and flew out to L.A., met with David's lawyers. It was quite a big law firm, and of course they were doing it pro bono for David, and I put the contract in front of them, and they didn't even look at it. They just told David to sign it. They said, any idiot that's going to want to take this film, let him have it. So I did get worldwide rights on it at that time. But
so obviously you had some...
The UK was really very important in terms of how many filmmakers it influenced there.
Yeah. You obviously had some communication with Lynch during this time. What kind of...
Well, to the extent that you could communicate with David. Since then, David has become much more articulate. David did stay with me, I don't remember the exact time. It may have been a month or two as we were launching or opening the film. And he would go to... Well, actually, his wife Mary was with him, and he would go to the McDonald's, and they'd both be asleep by 10 o'clock at night.
Oh, wow.
So I don't remember having a really serious conversation with him. I mean, we did have it, but it wasn't... As a lot of... since he was a painter, I mean, his natural bent was very tactile. I think that's sort of what attracted me to the film. Beginning, certain elements to it that were very, very tactile and painterly, and it just moved me very much in that way. And now, I think I once asked him, because somebody had asked me about, this film reminds me of a German expressionist cinema. And I asked David, had you ever seen any of those films? And he said no. And I said, well, don't.
I want to talk about some other high points of your career, and another favorite filmmaker of all of ours on the show, filmmakers, are the Coen Brothers. And I was wondering, how did your relationship with them begin?
Well, actually, they came to me in trying to get Blood Simple financed originally, and I really couldn't help them. But I saw there was something different. There was some spark there, and there was really very little I could do for them at that time, because they were just trying to raise the money to do it. And they went back to Minneapolis and raised the money on their own, and then by that time I had formed a partnership with Circle, releasing the Pettis Brothers in Washington, and it was actually shown by Skouras, who was handling it, and they showed it in Cannes, and I was there, and I didn't even see it because they thought they really had a horror film, and no one really saw it there. And it was quite a time after Cannes that Jim Jacks, who was working for us at that time, he saw it again in Los Angeles, and he called me and said, well, yeah, that's the film, because I was telling him about these guys, of course. So we wound up picking it up for distribution and then produced their next 3 films, which was Raising Arizona, Miller's Crossing, and Barton Fink.
Oh, goodness, wow.
Wow.